We are super excited to continue Governance Week. We have our last two talks today. We're going to be deep into the mechanics of voting with a lot of interesting implications for Web3, and we're delighted to have Peter Buisseret here from the government department at Harvard to talk to us about instant runoff voting. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Thanks very much, Andy. And thank you all very much for an incredibly stimulating week that's really broadened my horizons. So I'm going to talk about instant runoff voting today. Just a quick word about terminology. Some of you may have heard the term ranked choice voting used in the US political discourse. What they're talking about is what I'm describing today. And since I know there's at least one Englishman in the audience, I'll also say that the alternative vote is equivalent to what I'm describing today. So before I describe how it works, and I will give you an illustration, let me just give you a sense of where you might expect to see it in traditional elections as well as in Web3. So instant runoff voting, I contend, is the most rapidly expanding and controversial electoral reform of the last 5 years in the United States. There's about 13.5 million voters using it in traditional elections to elect offices ranging from local, state, and federal. So notable examples, since we're in New York, include the 2021 Democratic mayoral primary, which rolled out instant runoff voting to select Eric Adams to be its candidate, and some elections in Alaska, which now uses instant runoff voting for federal offices as well as for the gubernatorial race. And I'll talk about Alaska quite a bit as a running example. It's been banned in Florida. There's some contention about the consistency of instant runoff voting with a state constitutional requirement, and I'll comment on that later too. But it's become, like so many things, quite a partisan sort of debate. But it's widely used in the US and continues to expand. It's also used, in fact, in Web3. So ENS, in September of 2022, the token holders approved a proposal to create an endowment out of Treasury and to put out a request for proposals for an endowment manager. That vote approved for a working group to select the endowment manager without further participation by token holders, but the group actually narrowed down 8 proposals to 3 and put them to a final vote of the token holders using instant runoff voting. The final 3 plus an option, none of the above. And Maker also uses IRV for its governance polls. Okay, so it's been rolled out in both traditional and Web3 contexts. So how does it work? I'm going to describe the process. You're going to find that description a bit confounding, so then I'm going to illustrate it with an application from Alaska. So the goal of instant runoff voting is to select a single alternative from a set. What we're going to do is ask voters to rank the alternatives according to their preference. In some applications, we'll compel voters to rank every alternative on the ballot. In others, we'll allow them to rank as few as they wish. If any alternative commands a majority of first preferences, that alternative is going to be chosen and the election concludes. Otherwise, the alternative with the fewest first preferences is going to be eliminated, and we'll proceed to a second round of counting. In that round, we'll keep using the first preferences of candidates who haven't been eliminated, but we'll go to the ballots of voters whose first-ranked candidate was eliminated and see who was second-ranked, and we'll award that ballot to the corresponding candidate. If anyone has a majority, the election ends. Otherwise, we proceed sequentially using each voter's most preferred alternative from the set of alternatives that have not yet been eliminated. So at some point, by construction, an alternative will secure the support of a majority of ballots that have not been exhausted. So some voters may have stopped ranking after the first candidate. Those ballots will be tossed away once that first preference is eliminated. Okay? Now, if that's a little bit confusing, let me give you an example from Alaska in 2022. So there was a special election in Alaska for the single congressional seat following the death of the incumbent. And there were 3 candidates in the general election ballot. Nick Begich comes from an Alaskan political family of Republicans, Sarah Palin, who I presume needs no introduction, and Mary Peltola, who was the Democratic candidate. And what am I showing you on this column? If you look at my first column, I have a ballot that was submitted that ranked Begich first, followed by Palin second, followed by Mary Peltola, or which ranked Begich first, followed by Palin, and failed to rank Peltola. Those two ballots are equivalent under the mechanism. And what this tells me is that 27,053 voters submitted such a ballot. Okay, so some voters may have only submitted a first preference in favor of a single candidate. And how are we going to figure out who wins the election? So the first thing we're going to do is sum over all the first preferences that were awarded to each of the candidates. So all first three columns have in common the property that Begich is the first ranked candidate. And that sums to nearly 54,000. We do that for the rest of the candidates, and we see that Mary Peltola wins a plurality of first preferences. But she doesn't manage to secure a majority. So we eliminate Begich, who won the fewest first preferences, and we proceed to a second count in which Peltola and Palin continue to win the first preferences of voters who ranked them first. But we now look at the ballots cast in favor of Begich. We look to see where Peltola was ranked second, and we award these ballots to Peltola. And in that second round count, Peltola once again wins a majority of non-exhausted ballots. There were some votes, obviously, that didn't flow to either of the two candidates because these voters ranked Begich first and didn't express a preference over Palin versus Peltola. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Much more attractive looking Sankey chart for the IRV application in that endowment vote. So in that case, in the first round, none of the above had a strong plurality. But over a sequence of rounds of elimination and the flowing of second preferences, actually the alternative that came third, according to first preferences, ultimately won in the final round against none of the above. So Karpathy eventually won. And this highlights a feature of instant runoff voting that it can be very difficult for people to get their head around, which is that an alternative that wins sort of the most first preferences might ultimately not be selected through the mechanism. The way I want to structure the talk, I'm going to first describe what I call the social choice approach to thinking about electoral systems. This will not contain any original insights from me. And by social choice, I mean an approach in which we fix a set of alternatives, we come to some agreement about normatively desirable properties of a voting system, a means to aggregate preferences or information, and we ask which systems, if any, satisfy those properties. And I'm going to give you a very practical aspect of that. I'm going to talk about vote splitting and the role of spoiler candidates in elections. Okay, so these are kind of the key headline considerations that are important from this approach. And then I'll talk about some original work that I've done with my co-author Carlo Prato at Columbia, which I'll call the political economy approach, and I'll tell you more about that shortly. So what is kind of the main appeal of IRV in terms of voting relative to a traditional plurality rule in which we would just take your first preferences and decide the election winner on that basis? The key idea is that IRV can help to better protect latent majorities of voters from splitting their votes in ways that are harmful to them. And what do I mean by that? Well, imagine that we had taken the votes as cast in this ENS election, and we had simply taken the alternative that won the most first preferences. Obviously, if your eyesight is very good, none of the above would have won. But ex post, a majority of voters would have preferred for Karpathy to have been chosen. Why would it not have been successful? Because those who agreed that Karpathy was superior to none of the above disagreed about which of the remaining proposals they liked the most, and they divided their votes. And this sequential elimination mechanism sort of ensures the majority against that ex post disappointment. Now, as it happens, this outcome has another very desirable normative property, which is that if we had had a pairwise vote between Karpathy and any of the other alternatives, Karpathy would have won. So in a very strong sense, Karpathy is a majority preferred option. We call it the Condorcet winner. Under plurality, of course, it would not have been chosen. So you might be asking, well, is that a property of which we can be assured in any IRV election? And I'm afraid the answer is in general no. And to illustrate that, I can go back to my Alaskan example. Suppose that I had taken Sarah Palin off the ballot, fixed the behavior of voters, okay, so presume that this is how they vote regardless of whether Palin is on or off the ballot, and imagine that we just sum over the ballots in which a preference for Begich versus Peltola is expressed, and then we sum over the ballots for which a preference of Peltola over Begich is expressed. So we have a pairwise contest between those two candidates. We see that Nick Begich defeats Mary Peltola. Similarly, if I had taken Peltola off the ballot and done the same exercise of a pairwise vote between Begich and Palin, Begich would also defeat Palin in pairwise majority voting. So Begich was in fact the majority preferred candidate in this sense, but IRV didn't use that information. It solicited a full ranking of candidates, but Begich didn't make it to the second round because of vote splitting amongst the majority. So, Republicans divided their votes between Begich and Palin. Somewhat surprisingly, the Republican candidates in that election, some of them encouraged their voters not to rank the other candidate second. So there was quite a bit of sort of animosity between those candidates. And so a lot of people who ranked Begich first ultimately did not express a second preference. What I want to make very clear is that fixing the behavior of voters, the outcome of this election would have been the same under plurality, a point not necessarily appreciated in the aftermath of the election.
So what you allude to discussion after the election. What was the narrative that emerged after this?
The discussion was, let me sort of summarize it heuristically. My reading of it was people said, how can we be electing a Democrat in Alaska? And because IRV was still it was, as far as I believe it was the first congressional election in Alaska since IRV had been implemented, it was sort of viewed as a progressive plot. That would be my summary. So, as I say, the presence of Palin on the ballot was probably the reason why Peltola won in both the August election and, surprisingly enough, in November when there was a regular congressional election, almost exactly the same outcome. These three candidates, vote splitting amongst the conservative, leads to the election of Sarah Palin through exactly the same force. So that's the discussion. I think there's just a strong sense that, in a state that traditionally elects Republicans, if we choose a new system and it doesn't elect a Republican, there must be something going wrong. And there are versions of that across the spectrum, to be clear. Yeah, there's a question at the back.
How often is this true at the bottom? Like, my understanding is that most of the time in practical elections, the IRV doesn't make a difference.
That's correct. So for some reason, the number that comes to my head when you say that, someone said they had looked at some elections over the last 10 years, and it was something like 15% of cases it made a difference. Obviously, in the Karpathy example, it made a difference. But yes, very often it does not make a difference to the outcome. Okay, but it could. And that's a point that's not kind of, the desirability of it doing so is not universally appreciated. Yeah, that's right. But empirically, it is pretty rare. If you look at all the New York races that were conducted under instant runoff voting, a very, very small fraction. Hypothesizing that the voter behavior wouldn't have changed across the two rules, the outcome is almost the same in almost all of those cases. So what am I talking about the political economy approach? So the social choice approach emphasizes selection from a fixed set of alternatives. We don't know how the alternatives arose. We presume they're there, and we ask, how should we make a decision? What I'm going to call the political economy approach emphasizes that alternatives are strategic objects. They're chosen by interested parties, for example, political parties or individual candidates, or maybe stakeholders, that respond, those choices, to different strategic incentives generated by electoral rules. Now, you might say, well, why are you hawking the political economy approach? First of all, of course, it's my livelihood. But second of all, many IRV enthusiasts in the United States believe that the implication of introducing IRV is that it will moderate the kind of proposals that candidates offer in elections. And let me give you a kind of fly-by-night intuition for why they think that's true. In a plurality rule election, I, as a candidate, can only benefit from the support of voters who rank me first. Okay, that's just a mechanical property of the rule. That's a very demanding criterion, especially in polarized elections where bases are kind of ossified around candidates. In an instant runoff voting election, I can benefit from the support even of voters who don't rank me first. Okay, they might rank me second, and their preferred candidate might be eliminated. And so the intuition loosely goes, the ability to win second preferences should create an additional margin of competition that will somehow encourage candidates to reach out more broadly from their bases. Okay, so actually, to address that, you need to think about the strategies of the candidates. And what I'm going to do today is give you a very stylized model that we wrote for the purposes of this talk to ask, is that intuition necessarily true? And I'm going to show you that the conclusions from the social choice approach, the idea that protecting majorities from vote splitting is an unambiguously desirable thing, may turn out to be false. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next. So here's a model. This is what we call a just so model in the business. So it's a model that is constructed around the goal of pushing an incentive that we think is very important to the fore. It's not designed to be a general conclusion about the nature of instant runoff voting. Okay, so I'm going to impose a lot of structure, and then we're going to solve the model. So I'm going to have a unit mass of voters who have to make a collective choice A. Okay, and A is going to be a number between -1 and 1. The voter's payoff, so if I'm voter I, my payoff can be decomposed into two components. What you can think of as an ideological component, where each voter is going to have a preference type, which we're going to think of as her preferred policy, A sub I, and she's going to be more and more unhappy as the winning alternative is further away from her ideal policy. Okay? So that's what this picture is intended to indicate. And you can think of ideology in terms of progressive versus conservative, or you could think of it as something like, how much concentration of authority do I want in my organization? -1 is Web 2 and +1 is Web 3. And we'll have an additively separable term, which I'm going to call quality, which is designed to capture common value aspects. So regardless of our disagreement on ideology, we all want, for example, projects where the cost is lower. It will be fine in our framework for you to think of the quality as belonging to the proposer who will implement the policy, and then you could think about it as their competence. And I'm going to assume that voters are differentiated in their ideological preferences and that they're uniformly distributed over -1, 1. To get us further along in the analysis, I'm going to assume that there are two proposals that are already on the table. I'm going to call them X and Y very evocatively. And you can think of them as proposals that reflect the positions of established political parties. So it could be there's the Democrats and the Republicans, or it could be conservative and Labour that have established their positions over many, many electoral cycles in which they can't change in any given one. Or it could be that there are groups of stakeholders whose positions are well known and who have already submitted proposals for a vote. And I'm going to focus on the choice of a strategic proposer who's going to introduce a third proposal onto the table, which I'm going to call Z. Proposer is free to choose any location she likes, and I'm going to assume that her objective is solely to maximize the probability that her proposal is adopted. Okay, so you could think of this as a third-party candidate trying to enter, okay? Or you could think of it as a small stakeholder trying to introduce a third proposal into an otherwise polarized environment. Okay, and I'm just going to fix each of the two existing proposals at -1 and +1. And I'm just going to set the quality of those proposals equal to 0. I'll assume that the quality of proposal Z is a random variable. It won't be known to the proposer at the time that she chooses. I'll assume that it's uniformly drawn between -1 and 1. So you can think of Q as the quality of the proposal, or indeed the net quality over the two status quo alternatives. Making it random just ensures that the outcome of the election is uncertain from the proposer's perspective when she chooses policies. Okay? So the timing is that my proposer will choose her proposal, again, to maximize her probability that her option is chosen. Q is going to be realized, publicly observed, and I'll assume that everyone votes sincerely. That's not a trivial presumption in a three-candidate election, but let's put that aside for now. And then the winner will be determined under plurality and under instant runoff voting. And my goal is going to be to try and use this framework to investigate this incentive to propose moderate policies under one rule versus the other. Okay? So everyone clear? Yeah?
Can you say for people what you mean by vote sincerely?
Yes, exactly. So what I'm going to assume is that the ballots that my voters submit is a true statement of their ranking. So if you prefer Z over -1, you rank Z above -1 when you submit your ballot. You don't try to strategically influence the outcome of the election by reversing the order of preferences when you submit your ballots. Thank you. Okay.
Peter, is the
Ethan, yeah.
model of, with the linear preferences, is the model of uncertain quality equivalent to uncertainty about the median voters?
Yes, you can do this exactly. So you could assume that, you could instead have assumed that there's a mean of this distribution and the mean is subject to some aggregate uncertainty. It was just easier to get through the analysis fast. So this is the equivalent of stochastic valence, and it just makes the outcome of the election uncertain. That's exactly right. Good. I also prefer this formulation because it's very clear what it means to moderate in a model where the ideological preferences of voters are known. So that's just a stylistic preference. So preliminary steps in our analysis. The first claim is that it's without loss of generality to look for a best response of my strategic proposer from 0 up to 1. Why is it without loss of generality? There's a lot of symmetry built into this model. And if and only if some z in 0 or 1 is a best response, then minus z will also be a best response. Remember, minus 1 and 1, they're at the same, they're kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. They both have the same quality. So I'm just going to look for an optimal z between 0 and 1, and in parentheses, if I find such a z, remember that minus z and plus z will both be best responses. Nice feature of this setup is that the decision of a voter to cast her first preferences is quite straightforward. In particular, if I'm a voter whose ideal policy lies somewhere between minus 1 and 0, I'm going to claim that the only possibility for my first preference is that either I like minus 1 the most or I like z the most. Why is that the case? Minus 1 and plus 1, by assumption, both have a quality of 0, so they're equivalent in terms of this second component. But minus 1 is closer to my ideal policy than plus 1, and so I'll always rank minus 1 ahead of plus 1. The only possibility is either that z is close enough to my ideological preference that I like it on ideological grounds, or the realization of its quality might be large enough that I'm prepared to accept it, even if in spatial terms it's worse for me. So if I'm a voter with an ideal policy ai between minus 1 and 0, my first preference will either go to minus 1 or z. And by the same argument, if I'm a voter with an ideal policy between 0 and 1, my first preference will either go to plus 1 or it will go to z. I haven't said anything about second preferences yet. Second claim, I'm going to be able to identify for any choice of z and any realization of q a cutoff type of voter between minus 1 and 0, possibly at the boundaries, such that the first preference decision rule is to vote for the alternative minus 1 if my ideological type is to the left of that threshold L, and to vote for z as my first preference if my type is to the right of that threshold. And I'm going to find that by looking for an indifferent type, a voter who is exactly indifferent between those two alternatives, and I'm going to get a formula for that. And just as a sense check, if q were realized to be 0, okay, so that all three proposals were equivalent in terms of quality, the indifferent type is just the midpoint of the two platforms. Remember, voters have these symmetric loss functions. Okay? And obviously, as q gets bigger and bigger, this guy is going to get pushed further and further over here because there are more voters who are willing to support z despite its inferiority in terms of ideology because the quality realization was more favorable. And again, I'm going to find a threshold which I'm going to call r, such that a voter with a type to the left of r and to the right of 0 will support z, and a voter whose type is closer to 1 on the right side of r supports plus 1. Same logic. Okay, if q is equal to 0, that cutoff type is just the midpoint between the two platforms, and as q increases, it's going to push further to the right. So you can think of L and R as kind of swing voters. They're the kind of marginal preference type that demarcates the support for z versus each of the two more extreme proposals. So finally, we can start asking the interesting question. So what is the optimal proposal under a plurality rule? Mechanically, it's going to be the one that maximizes the probability that the alternative z is chosen, which means the alternative z getting more votes than each of the other candidates on the table. Okay, so what does that mean? All we care about is first preferences. What is the vote share of alternative z? It's just the CDF of all the types between R and L. So those are the ones who are supporting z. Remember that my ideological preferences are uniform, so it's just R minus L divided by 2. And that's going to have to be greater than or equal to the maximum of the votes accruing to minus 1, all the types between minus 1 and L, and all the preference types between R and 1. Quick phase of algebra, and we're going to get, not surprisingly, a threshold on q as a function of z, above which the alternative z is chosen. So my problem, thus, is to minimize this constraint to make it as undemanding as possible. I want to make that threshold q as small as possible if my goal is to win. And why must that imply that the optimal choice is 0? Suppose I start from 0 and I move my proposal z a little bit to the right. There are two effects. I move this swing voter further to the right because I'm appealing more on ideology. Okay, so I'm making a voter who was previously indifferent between myself and 1 at a given q now strictly prefers me. So that's good in the sense of helping me to defeat 1, but I'm tightening the constraint on defeating minus 1 because I'm also moving this voter, this indifferent voter type, further to the right. This was a type that was indifferent between me and my opponent, and now I've upset her by moving away. Now she strictly prefers -1. Okay, and to balance those two incentives, I want to put my proposal smack bang in the center, where each of the two constraints on winning is exactly as tight as the other. Okay, so z equals 0 is my best response.
Voters are uniformly distributed, right? We didn't
That's
have
right.
This is what's going on because the support of the distribution of Q is so big that I'm running up into the boundaries.
So there is an implicit presumption, which is correct, that at the threshold where the candidate wins, both L and R must be interior to -1 and 0 respectively, and Z and 1 respectively. So I know that at the threshold, I know I'm not, for example, in a situation where R is strictly to the right of 1.
But no, so I've got Z at 0, and I'm getting all the voters between L and Q.
That's right.
And now I consider a marginal move to the right,
That's right.
and L and Q move the exact same amount.
It's exactly
and
right.
we have a uniform distribution.
That's right.
And I'm still getting everybody in between those two.
That's right, but it's the extremes that I'm changing. So in a two-candidate election, yeah, the vote share that I'm getting is the same actually with the uniform, because I'm weighting them by the density, but the density is the same. But as I move to the right, I'm also increasing the votes of this person at the rate at which I'm decreasing them for that person. And so those two forces are pushing me in opposite directions in terms of winning out against the most demanding of those two.
I see. And I'm getting, in expectation, I'm getting a third of the vote
Exactly.
because of the symmetry.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Good. So what do we see from this? And by the way, I'll show you what the planner would choose. So if someone just wanted to maximize the welfare of all of the voters in this model, I'll tell you what they would choose in a minute. But moderation is the name of the game, in fact, under plurality. The reason is that in some sense, the threat of vote splitting is quite dangerous for candidate Z. It might be that Z is majority preferred, but as she moves further to the right, she's opening up the opportunity for for -1 to win, and she knows that she can't count on the support of any voter between R and 1. Okay, those votes for R and 1, even if these voters prefer Z to -1, they can't express that in the ballot, and so vote splitting is quite dangerous, and it's a form of discipline, and that's a theme that I'm going to return to later on. So what about instant runoff voting? What is the optimal proposal under instant runoff voting? For sure, the alternative Z is not going to win if the alternative -1 gets a majority of first preferences. Remember that under instant runoff voting, if anyone wins a majority in the first round, that alternative is going to be selected. Otherwise, the candidate with the fewest first preferences will be eliminated, and her second preferences will be redistributed. So a necessary condition for Z to win is that this cutoff type L had better be to the left of 0. Because if it's to the right, it means that everyone between -1 and 0 is voting for -1, and it's winning a majority. So necessary condition is that this cutoff type L be strictly less than 0. And I'm going to assert that's equivalent to the condition Q is bigger than something, a function of Z. It turns out, and here I'm going to wave my hand and say, trust me, that whenever that condition is satisfied, I know that +1 is not winning a majority, okay? Because it could be that +1 wins a majority, in which case, I also lose. But I know that under the conditions that -1 fails to, the alternative +1 doesn't, and Z is in a very privileged position in the sense that anyone who supports either of the two extreme alternatives with respect to first preferences will give their second preferences to alternative Z, by virtue of the fact in some sense that it's the moderate alternative. Okay? So what does this tell me? What is Z's problem? Z just needs to be chosen to kind of maximize the probability that -1 fails to win a majority, and Z gets at least the second highest share of the vote in the first round. Getting the second highest share of the vote in the first round and denying -1 a majority is sufficient to trigger a second round in which Z has to win. It's going to get the second preferences of anyone who supported the alternative that was defeated. Okay, so we have now a necessary and sufficient condition, Q strictly larger than Z -1. And if you remember, under plurality, the only difference with this expression is that we had a max here. Because under plurality, you have to get the most votes when you enter in between the two alternatives to win. Here, you just have to get, not the strictly fewest votes. Okay, and this is the key difference. So vote splitting is very problematic to the centrist alternative under plurality, No problem under instant runoff voting. Instant runoff voting is kind of insuring the proposer against the risks of vote splitting by helping to coordinate the majority around her in the second round of counting. I'm going to argue that this creates a bit of an indiscipline which will ultimately be harmful. So rewrite this condition, and now instead of a max, we have a min. And if I'm going to look for the z that minimizes this constraint, that again makes the threshold q above which I win the election as slack as possible, is to choose z equal to 1/2. And what's notable about this is that it's exactly the opposite of the intuition that I proposed, or that I've filtered for you from other proposals. It suggests that IRV is encouraging the proposer to choose less moderation than under plurality. How do we compare these rules, and which one is better? Let's let W of ZS denote the average payoff under rule S, so either plurality or instant runoff voting, when the proposer chooses Z. So the idea is, fix the rule, pick a particular Z, write down, for every possible quality realization who's the winner and what the associated payoff of each voter is, average over quality, average over all the voters, that's welfare, and then compare those two across the two rules. Insight one is that if you just give me a fixed alternative, and I'm going to call this the social choice insight, for any fixed Z, it is always better, in terms of average payoffs, to use instant runoff voting versus plurality. And it's exactly the social choice insight that I highlighted earlier. Instant runoff voting protects the majority from vote splitting, and it helps the more moderate proposal to beat out one of the more extreme proposals. Okay, so fixing the Z, you like instant runoff voting more. However, the bad news here, and I'll comment on robustness in just a second, is that that conclusion reverses when you evaluate average welfare under each rule at the proposer's optimal choice. So if I evaluate the welfare under plurality at the choice of 0, and I compare that to welfare under instant runoff voting at the proposer's optimal choice of 1/2, the value reverses. Why? There's a direct and an indirect effect. The social choice insight is buried in this calculation. So, fixing the proposals, instant runoff voting is creating a boost to the more moderate proposal's chances of winning. But there's an indirect effect, which is that the proposer is taking advantage of that to make the moderate proposal less moderate. Because the proposer knows the only way she can benefit from second preferences is if she defeats the candidate who's holding them. Okay, so the more general kind of force that's going on here is the proposer says, the fact that I can win your second preferences doesn't mean I need to go after them. I can only benefit from those second preferences if I defeat you in the first round of counting. So now my problem is not to kind of make sure that I stop -1 from winning a plurality. My problem is to defeat proposals whose supporters are likely to rank me second in order to benefit from this dividend of second preferences.
Is this the right comparison? So you've written a model where you're forcing a third party candidate to enter, and I think like a standard kind of thought would be under plurality rule where they can't get better than a third of a chance of winning, right? Entry is it's very hard to get a third party candidate to enter, whereas under IRV where they can get a high probability of winning, it's true they're less moderate in equilibrium, but you're going to get way more entry. And you've stacked the deck in some sense by forcing entry.
100%. So a comment I was going to make, but you've exactly anticipated is, suppose that you now wanted to build on top of that the alternative not to propose in the first place. And suppose that making a proposal is costly. Okay, so whether it is indeed costly will probably depend on the application, but certainly in the context of electoral systems, one of the reasons that third parties in the UK are quite fond of instant runoff voting, the Liberal Democrats, for example, made a condition of entering coalition government with the Conservatives, the holding of a referendum on it, is they think it makes it easier for them to kind of run candidates and have a chance of winning. Imagine that there was some cost of entry such that the candidate or the proposer is only prepared to place Z on the table if the probability of winning is big enough. That will generate an interval of costs where under plurality, Z will not be chosen. And under IRV, you will enter and you will have this more moderate proposal. And then things get a bit trickier. But in fact, even in this setting, the assumption that Q is uniformly distributed on -1 to 1 heightens the rhetorical power of this example, because indeed it is the case that payoffs are worse under instant runoff voting. But in general, there would be a trade-off between the indirect and direct effect, and the force that you're highlighting would just stack more in favor of the direct effect, which is we want to stimulate entry. So I completely agree. My claim is that this is more of a sandbox for an intuition on which you can have exactly these kinds of insights. You can think about strategic entry exactly as you suggested. Final nugget, which I didn't anticipate, but which I think is quite interesting. You might ask the question, if my goal were to maximize average payoffs by choice of z under each of the two rules, what would I want to choose? Now, the choice of z is 0 is kind of very appealing in the sense that it minimizes the average loss. Okay, so in a spatial sense, z equals 0 is a really good compromise. And indeed, the planner would choose z star equals 0 under plurality. Surprisingly, at least for me, the planner would not choose z star equals 0 under instant runoff voting. The planner would indeed like the proposer to shift her proposal a little bit to the right, okay, to take advantage of getting those second preferences and helping the moderate proposal to be elected. And the planner would be willing to trade off the degree of moderation in order to give even more of a boost by helping this proposal to defeat +1. Okay? However, the planner would not want all the way to 1/2. Okay, so it's still the case that the proposer is choosing kind of too extreme in a proposal relative to what would be chosen in the first best. So in the final moments, let me just quickly give you some, I don't want to say insights, but maybe reflections on instant runoff voting from traditional elections that may have some relevance for Web3 considerations. So one thing I hear a lot, and I've heard it this week, is that participation is a big problem. And one of the arguments made by proponents of instant runoff voting is that it increases people's propensity to participate, that somehow having more candidates I can rank gives me a higher sense of efficacy. Unfortunately, the evidence does not favor that. So the elections that we have, turnout has not increased after switching from plurality to instant runoff voting. Another interesting problem or kind of conceptual challenge is that there are extensive and intensive margins of participation in instant runoff voting. In a plurality rule election, you either turn out or you don't. But in an instant runoff voting election, conditional on participating, if you have the option not to fully rank the ballot, you also have to decide how many candidates I want to rank. And if you're worried about inequities in participation, and if you think that that intensive margin of participation also varies across different kinds of stakeholders, then your concern might be justified. So in that Alaska election that I told you about, only 2/3 of voters ranked more than one candidate. And of those who only ranked a single candidate, 75% said it was because it was the only candidate I liked. Carlo and I put a survey at the end of the mayoral election in New York, and we got very similar results. So many voters chose not to rank the candidates, and they said, either I didn't know who they were, or I just didn't like them enough. This audience probably will be aware that confusion about the system, and indeed execution errors, can create a lot of space for doubts about legitimacy. So you may remember that during the first round of results for the New York mayoral race, the New York Board of Elections released results prematurely. There were some test ballots kind of bundled in, and it really shook a lot of faith in the operation of the system. It was an example of an election in which the candidate who won a plurality in the first round ultimately won a majority. But had that not been the case, there could have been a lot more blowback. I highlighted that strategic voting might be a consideration. So there are incentives when you have 3 or more candidates to sometimes submit a ballot that does not reflect your true ranking of candidates. For example, in Alaska, if you wanted to help Mary Peltola win, you might have thought that one of the 2 other candidates had a better chance of being defeated by her. You might want to have ranked that candidate first to help them get into the second round, where you believe that your preferred candidate would win. So those incentives exist, but it's really hard for voters to figure out what to do. There's some experimental evidence I can talk about. One novel feature of the DAO applications that I highlighted at the beginning is that you have public voting over a period of time where you can see how the results are shaping up, and you have the opportunity to revise your vote before the end, which is something I don't see in real-world elections or traditional elections, but is a very interesting feature. And more broadly, thinking beyond instant runoff voting to voting rule choice in general, I think there are 2 features of design that are often conflated, but which should be conceptually distinct. The first is, what information do we want to elicit from voters? What do we want to learn about their preferences? That's what we would call ballot structure. In plurality, we just ask you to give us the most preferred alternative. Preferential voting methods, which include but are not limited to instant runoff voting, effectively ask you for all pairwise rankings. Okay? You submit a list, and under some assumptions about the structure of your preferences, that list conveys all the possible information that you could give me, okay? All ordinal information. A second question is, how should you use the information that voters submit to choose a winning candidate? Okay, and IRV puts a big wedge in between 1 and 2 because it elicits all this information about pairwise comparison that is ultimately discarded by the aggregation mechanism. And there are ways to modify and fine-tune instant runoff voting that would fix some of the pathologies I described earlier. Okay, so there are very simple ways to change instant runoff voting that are on the table that would kind of do better in at least some applications with respect to point 2. And so my view at the end of the day is that in the traditional world of elections, IRV reflects a kind of compromise between the parsimony and the simplicity and the transparency of the principle of plurality voting, that whoever gets the most votes wins, versus perhaps a desire to make more use of the information that is revealed by ballots. Okay? And without knowing exactly where that trade-off should go in Web3, my feeling is, and this is just my view, whatever you think that trade-off calibrates to in a traditional election, my feeling is that Web3 could go more in favor of 2, could do more kind of fancy things, really because, first of all, the participants to these elections are quite sophisticated. Reading the discussion that followed that vote, people had some very, very sophisticated ideas about why the system might work and some of its shortcomings. And then, of course, the obvious one is that execution is a lot less error-prone when it's done through smart contracts. Okay. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions now or afterwards, and thank you again for such a stimulating week.